Is it possible to put a price on peace in the Middle East? And if you knew that number, would you be willing to pay off your enemies? Well, it turns out that might be exactly what's happening in Afghanistan. Independent contracting companies are being accused of paying Taliban forces off. And here to discuss, well, whether it's actually possible to do that is the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy and Civil Society, Barak Hoffman. Mr. Hoffman, thanks for being here today. Talk to me about this concept. I mean, some people say you're going to keep bombing the Taliban. It's not going to do anything. It's just going to reinforce their strength. So is this a healthy alternative?
It's not entirely clear what the policy is at this point. It seems to be changing day by day. If you go back to Obama's West Point speech a few months ago, it sounded like it was pretty clear that the purpose was to defeat or at least weaken the Taliban to the extent that the Afghan government could come and take over. Now we seem to be shifting a policy in terms of negotiating, and part of that is paying people not to fight. But it doesn't seem to be embedded in a more comprehensive strategy, as it seems to be shifting day by day, as we saw today in the London conference, where there was a huge range of opinions on what we ought to be doing in Afghanistan.
I mean, it's pretty interesting because you can pay them today to not fight today, but
Absolutely.
Then what happens tomorrow and next year?
Well, not only that, you also create a huge demand. You basically giving people an incentive to go and fight, or at least threaten to go and fight, and say, well, pay me not to fight. So you have the potential to create a whole supply of people who are just looking for handouts.
And they're going to come to expect this. Well, let's talk a little bit about peace. I mean, this concept seems sometimes a long way off, but what is the price of peace?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very good and hard question to answer. For years, it had been our policy that we had to destroy the Taliban, or at least weaken them to an extent that the Afghan government could control it. And if listening to what happened today in London, and we've been hearing the past few days, is that, well, now we're going to negotiate with the Taliban. Is that because we've realized they're not a threat anymore? They're certainly no weaker. In fact, they're stronger. Or it's really becoming very difficult to understand what the policy is. And what the Afghan government wants seems to be negotiations with the Taliban, whether we want it or not.
And I mean, do you think that the government there is in a tough spot? Because, I mean, they have to protect their own people, too. And the Taliban are, living in their areas. How do you do this? How do you govern a people, protect a people, try to work with other countries like the United States?
I think that's our policy, the U.S. policy, had been to build up the Afghan government and the Afghan army so they could go and govern and create security, but they were unable to do that, and the Afghan government seemed not interested. And so the Taliban came in and filled a gap, and they are providing security. And now it sort of seems that the Karzai government wants to negotiate with them to bring them into the government, and so it's not entirely clear what our policy is going to be going forward, as we seem to be saying, on the one hand, we need to weaken the Taliban, and at the same time, it's okay to negotiate with them.
Well, I mean, is there any way to monitor, to follow the money, if you will, to monitor, are these contracting companies, many of them from the United States, how do we know who they're paying money to? How do we know where the Taliban's getting their money?
In fact, we can't. We've tried this in the past. There was an effort to buy off fighters before, and it didn't work for a variety of reasons, one of which was exactly what you said. There was sort of no way to monitor that people lived up to their agreements, so they would take the money, and then they would rejoin a militia soon after and keep fighting. So it's very, very difficult, and even Ambassador Eikenberry freely admits, and so does General McChrystal, that their intelligence on the ground is very, very poor, as we saw tragically a few weeks ago when the CIA agents were blown up by someone who they thought was a trusted informant.
And that's kind of the lesson we seem to be taking from all of this, is it's hard to know who you can trust. Well, thanks so much. That was Barak Hoffman, the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy and Civil Society. Thanks.